Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles.
We've been speaking, and talking about just, a number of the ways in which the difference between the way people are present religiously and feel religiously don't match. We were talking about the cafeteria worker who doesn't appear, Nati just sort of complains about the Minyan, and the guy pulls, in a very Israeli Sephardi style, pulls his kippah out of his pocket, but is like, oh, I would love to come, versus Nati, who is wearing a kippah, and so he's sort of suddenly being pressured to go, even though he has no interest in going. And now we're saying, okay, Nati has no interest in going to Minyan, but when it comes to kashrut, now suddenly he's worried about the hashgacha of this place and won't eat it because it's I don't know, where his attending physician, Barbara was saying that, different types of kippahs also, right? The Sephardi, the other guy has the kind of kippah that people will joke that has lines on it from being in your pocket, the folded in your pocket type of kippah, versus Nazis. But there's sort of this mismatch between all of the ways that people are sort of appearing religiously versus how they're actually feel and what they actually do in their religious lives.
Great, that's very interesting. Did you want to lead us into a topic based on that? Or
sure. So, what we had spoken about, it before watching the episode. We talked a little bit about Minyan and the, where's the idea of praying with a Minyan comes from, which is one of these topics that comes up in the episode. We said, there's a lot of topics that are kind of touched on in small ways. And with Minyan, it really comes up with Nazi. And I think actually it's in this episode sort of speaks to one of the beautiful elements of Israeli society in the way that, not just the fact that there's a Minyan there, but it's sort of the attending physician is complaining to Nati and saying, you have to go to Minyan because the maintenance people, are, complaining that that you're not coming to make Minyan. So the way that it's sort of, I often think about this when I'm in Israel, the way that, obviously not everywhere, but from, the people working at the gas station and the supermarket and wherever, are all just as Jewish. Not everyone's Jewish, but we're sort of not used to that in America, in most places at least, in the same way. But that there's this pressure to go daven in a Minyan, and Nati's I'm tired. I have a break. And this was attending's I don't care. You can break and rest when you're in the Minyan, but you got to physically be there with them. Even if you're not paying attention, even if you're not praying, I don't care. You just have to be in there. Whether that's because she's trying to push him religiously to have that structure, or it's because she just wants to be on good terms with the maintenance people. Either way, there's sort of that push to go there and to be part of this Minyan, which I think I'm sure a number of us have experienced that, and being part of a community and feeling that pressure, responsibility, guilt, whatever associated with showing up and being there in person for Minyaning like that.
Yeah, I really like this question that Norm just asked. So I'm going to respond to Rabbi Pernick, and then I'm going to respond to that question because this is a great question for Rebecca Schatz. I really like this question. I think that one of the things that comes up in this episode that's so interesting is that it's very clear to the audience that Minyan is preferred. Solo davening is kind of not looked on as you're doing the same mitzvah, right? And so when we're thinking about why that might be, you probably are guessing some of the things that the rabbis very explicitly say, which is if you go to a Minyan, not only are you doing it for yourself and are you allowed to say certain things in that Minyan, but you're also there for other people. And that's huge because if there are 9 people at a Minyan and you're the 10th, then if you don't go, they might not be able to say Kaddish, which is really of the most importance when it comes to Minyan. But also you wouldn't be able to say the Amidah aloud. You wouldn't be able to say the other Kaddishes. You wouldn't be able to say the Shema in its entirety, and so on and so on. The Baruch Hu. So read Torah. Anyway, so on and so on. So you wouldn't be able to necessarily do all of that if you weren't in a minyan. And one of the interesting pieces that I told Rabbi Pernick I wouldn't go into, but it seems like I'm going into it, is that the person who's telling him to go to minyan is a woman and he is a man. And the way that minyan works in that society, and specifically in that hospital in that moment, is that they need a 10th man. So even though she feels very strongly about allowing this minyan to happen and making sure that the minyan is there, can't do anything about it because her existence in that minyan is not being counted in the same way that his. There was one other thing that I was going to say about, Israel. When you're in Israel, as Rabbi mentioned, many times you'll be like in a cafe or walking down the street and a bunch of guys, this actually happened, I believe, with Rabbi Pernick, when we're walking down the street and a bunch of people come out and say, hey, we need a 10th for a minyan. They're not talking to me. They're talking to the guys that I'm with. And you then, I'm pretty sure that this happened with our group in Israel, you then, Rebecca, get left on the street while these men go into a room and go in for minyan for you don't know how long. You're just standing there kind of waiting for it to be over. And now some women would see that as degrading or you're not counted, so you don't mean anything. It's kind of nice to not have to go in and be part of the minyan in that particular instance. But it's also very, they're not even considering that I might think that they're talking to me, right? And it's a completely different culture around that. And so the attending who is talking to Nati seems to have that same kind of tone, that she knows that it's important. And she doesn't necessarily feel badly about it, but she wants to make sure that he goes because she can't go. And then now I want to answer, unless Rabbi Pernick wants to say something about that, I want to answer Norm's thing. Do you want to say anything?
No.
Oh, okay. So Norm wrote, don't you think that almost every Jew, to some extent, picks and chooses about some areas where they are very machmir, some about which they are relaxed, and some about which they are inconsistent? Yes, I do. And the easy answer would be, sure, in the conservative movement, like that's who we are. But it happens across all movements. It is not just a conservative movement thing. I can't speak for Haredi Jews. I don't have any friends in that movement, but I can speak to all the other movements. That yes, of course, every Jew, present company included, is choosing the things that mean a lot to me to make sure they are done to the extreme. And then things that I can be more lenient on for whatever reason I give, but I can be more lenient on. And the thing that I would take this even further to say is, going back to our conversation 2 weeks ago, is that the way that you look also sometimes determines what people think you are machmir about. So those of you who belong to Temple Beth Am know that very early on in coronavirus, and then I'll stop talking and Rabbi Pernick can talk. Very early on in coronavirus, our senior rabbi, Rabbi Adam Kligfeld, thought that he had coronavirus, and he had just been in the sanctuary. I think the day before, it was the end of Pesach, and I was supposed to go into the sanctuary the next day for Shabbos to lead services. And we were told that I couldn't go into the sanctuary because he had just been there and we didn't know what his test results would be. So we went back and forth on whether or not for me to set up a Zoom in my home, which we had not done at the time. We had not done any Zoom services. We had only used the live stream that's in our sanctuary that we don't have to touch or anything. It just goes on and goes off. If I should do that from my home. And the punchline is that I did, but it was extremely uncomfortable because it then seems as though, oh, well, the assistant rabbi, that new female that works at Temple Beth Am, she'll do anything on Shabbos. And I'm very, very nervous about that because of exactly what you're saying, Norm, that maybe that wasn't one of my hard lines. Now, it happens to be, but as soon as I turn on a computer in my home and I invite the entire congregation to see that I'm doing that, it's hard to maintain those lines. So anyway, I just ranted for a very long, many different topics. So I'm going to let Pernick take a turn ranting. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, one thing this is making me think of is like public versus private, which in the ways in which, to Norm's question, Norm, right?
Yes, Norm. Yes.
His comment about like, the ways in which everyone has the things they're machmir versus the things they're mekil, where you're strict and, and so forth.
Lenient.
And lenient, yeah, thank you. That they're like, so there's two things that come to mind. One is like one of my teachers in rabbinical schools grew up Satmar. And he's still kind of Satmar, but he's also not. And he like had a sicha, like a class basically, like a conversation, but a sicha is like when a rabbi has like a 40-minute talk that's like not text based. It's sort of like a broader topics. That's like sicha. And so he had like one that he like would give every couple of years talking about the importance of chumrah, the importance of like having stringencies. And, and like, he's like, if you're going to be lenient on one thing, then you need to have a corresponding chumrah that you're taking on. Like if you're going to say like, well, and I mean, when he's talking about being lenient on something, he's not talking about like not observing Jewish law, but if there's something where I'm going to be sort of going closer to the edge, and being more lenient than I was before, then you have to make sure you're sort of maintaining equilibrium about that. Not that everyone does it, but that was sort of a point that that he was making. But then the other point that I think is sort of the bigger one is about the public versus private and sort of the policy issues versus what people do in their personal life. And so I think like that's something that sort of comes up with for example, I mean, I guess you can say the Minyan, Nazi going to Minyan and something that's like visible for the world. Even this guy who Yifat's working with, who's saying, I'm not religious. And she's like, you look religious. And he's like, trust me, the things that you would care about, I'm not religious with. But those are all things like no one would see on the outside. I mean, on the outside, he keeps kosher, he keeps Shabbos, he keeps those things. He doesn't like tefillin, which is also private for most, if he's not going to show. So like, there's that piece, and then sort of the flip side where Rabbi Schatz is talking about of like, well, if I'm being asked to do something publicly, which I'm not even sure that I'm comfortable with privately, then like what message does that send? Most of the time we're talking about the other side of issues where it's I might publicly take on a sort of a religious persona, and in my private life, maybe I'm not so careful about using a meat fork with a milchik dish, whatever. But like, but when it comes to the flip side, what Rabbi Schatz is raising of like actually being asked to do something publicly, and like with Orthodoxy, this is a very big thing of like mechitzas and right things that are public markers of Orthodoxy. Mechitzas, kippot, minyan, like all of those kinds of things are sort of like big red lines that were drawn because they're very visible. And whether people are like laying tefillin every day or like being shomer negiah is sort of like whatever. We don't see it, so we're not going to ask questions. It's like there's the very much a sort of a dichotomy there.
It is interesting for Minyan though, because in the Shulchan Aruch, like in the major body of Jewish law that we take our Jewish law from, it's very clear about in terms of Minyan specifically, if you can't get your a minyan, you should at least daven when they're davening, right? So we have daily minyan every morning and every evening. And if minyan for us starts at 7:30 a.m. and you can't get to minyan, which right now is on Zoom, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, but if you can't get to minyan, then you should be davening still around the same time, so that it's as if your kavanah is that you are with the community, even if you can't do the same prayers that you would be able to say if you were actually in community with those people in the same room. So there is thought about minyan as private versus public, but it is in a similar category where your private practice still somehow influences your public choices and the things that you might do if you were able to get to that minyan or not. It is interesting. Karen gave us a whole list of that she enjoyed from this episode. And one of the things, kashrut. So Rabbi Pernick and I went back and forth up until minutes ago about whether or not we should talk about minyan or kashrut. Specifically,
or kippah, or I mean, right? There's like,
Yeah, specifically in the realm of kashrut, specifically around hashgacha, which is the stamp of approval of all shapes and sizes nowadays on food. Motzi, a women's thing. Do you mean instead of...
where what's his name is like holding up the challahs, I'm assuming, and sort of like without saying anything, asking if anyone else wants to lead, and they're all like, is that
because the woman can... Yeah. So a woman can... yes, Karen.
When he said by permission.
Shoot, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. It was translated. And I'm thinking, who is he? Why does he? I don't get it.
Yeah.
More formulaic.
Yeah, so it's so interesting. It's interesting how like English translations will change your thinking on that. So when someone does... Like when I do motzi in my home, unless I'm doing it alone, if I'm doing motzi for people, I'll say bir shoot, not because I literally need their permission, but it's because you've all washed your hands and it's the first person to speak. You're like making sure everyone's ready, right? You're basically saying, hello, are you ready? We're going to start now. If I say this, you're going to respond. It's the same as during Kiddush when you say l'chaim in the middle. It's kind of similar to that. It's like a little participatory to make sure everyone's awake. But motzi is something that women can do that trickles to the men, meaning it's a mitzvah that women can, it's not even a mitzvah. It's a thing. It's a bracha that can do that. If I said it, Rabbi Pernick wouldn't also have to say it. However, in some denominations of Judaism, more right-wing Orthodox denominations of Judaism, if a woman does kiddush, a man will say kiddush because the man believes he needs to sanctify Shabbat by saying kiddush from hearing it from a man or doing it as a man himself, as opposed to a woman doing it for him. Another topic for another time. So touching like shomer negia, if you're observing kiss on the cheek, because he kisses her on the cheek and she doesn't freak out, you mean?
Or he goes to kiss her and she like backs off.
Yeah.
No. She's talking about hodaya when Avri, nope, she's not. Okay.
I'm talking about, what's her name? And
Yifat.
With the guy from the poster thing, from the
brochure. The
brochure. And says we wouldn't be good together. And she's not buying it so much. You keep the Shabbos and blah, blah, blah. And then he goes to kiss her on the cheek, I assume, and she goes like this.
Yeah, it's very sweet of you to think that was on the cheek. I think that he was trying to make a point that it wasn't.
It wouldn't work.
Right. And that he was basically saying, like, I keep Shabbos and I keep kosher, but, like, I'd be willing to kiss a girl who I like, and you're going to...
More than that, actually, but okay.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. But I think that he was trying to show her that you would not be comfortable with my level of leniency. So let me show you. And he knew that she would back away. I thought you were referring to when Avery kisses the other one, Hodaya, on the cheek, and she doesn't care about that. But then she can't eat meat and milk.
Right?
I think Rabbi Pernick can speak more to Shomer Negia, but I believe that it kind of comes from, first of all, if that's a person that you've known for a long time, before you were Shomer Negia potentially, or not. In this case, that's not the case. He was talking like the private and the public, right, of what is appropriate, what's not, how did she feel about that, and the rest of it. Okay, should we go back to Minyan for a minute?
Yeah, I'm interested in, so Norm brings up this point about Minyan. I see the Friedmans also bring up a point about Minyan. But starting with the Norm one, which it's more based on characters in the episode, but this idea of, maybe the woman who's like Nati's attending isn't actually from, she just wants to accommodate these workers. And this is something, it's like, Nati, you should be doing this, you can be doing this. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. It's definitely a possibility. The fact that they sort of made a thing about her eating the sandwich made me think that she is religious, but maybe not.
Because she thought the hashgacha was okay, you mean?
Yeah, like the fact that they sort of like make a scene of him eating his gross cafeteria food while she has the sandwich from the place made me think that they were.
She didn't wash.
You're right. She didn't. So maybe she's not religious. You're right. I mean, I lived with two roommates when I was in New York City who were residents, and it's an interesting thing. I mean, because New York City is like fairly similar to Jerusalem. The ways in which like religious doctors are often asked to kind of step in and mediate conflicts by virtue of their religious status, which at times is frustrating to them. Like, my roommate, had stories about like, patients who were not in his department but like other doctors came to him because he's like the guy who wears a kippah, and they're like, we can't get this family to agree to take their grandma off the ventilator. She's brain dead. She's et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like, we cannot convince them to take her off the ventilator, which is a whole nother topic that we're not going to get into now. But like, they were like, oh, Rafi, like, can you go talk to them? He's like, that's not my issue. Like, this is not my patient. But because he's like the resident who wears a kippah, you're sort of like asked to step into situations that you wouldn't be asked to step into if you weren't wearing a kippah. So there might be a piece of that with Nazi. And yeah, maybe if it was other doctors there and it was like people who felt more like peers and friends, maybe it would be different than when it feels like, oh, I'm being asked to like help out the maintenance guys to make a minyan. So yeah, that definitely might play into that. But I hadn't thought about that, but I think that's an interesting point. Okay, well, let me see what the Friedmans talk about. If someone joins in as the 10th for minyan, and then later an extra person joins in, is there any obligation for the original 10th to stay in? No, there is not. That 10th can leave. As long as there is 10 there, it doesn't matter the makeup of those 10. So it can be a rotating 10th. I've certainly been in situations where that has happened.
When Betham is in person, as I mentioned, we have daily minyan bizman, meaning the time changes throughout potentially the week, but usually just by month. We change the time based on the time that you're supposed to be saying mincha and mariv. And so when it's really early, like it is it looks like it's 11 p.m. outside. When it's really early, the clergy very often will do exactly what you're describing, Leonard, which maybe this is why you're asking the question, where one person will come in, but then they have a meeting at 4 p.m. And so the other person will leave and the other clergy will come in and you rotate around to make sure that there are still 10 people, but we can't all be there at, 3 o'clock when we're supposed to be. So, okay. I just want to mention one thing. Karen Cass, I love you dearly. We're not going to do that right now, but I'm happy to talk to you about it any other time. So one thing I want to talk about is Minyan currently in the state of the world. So I don't know what's going on in New Orleans. I know what's going on at Rabbi Pernick's shul, but I don't know what's going on in general in the city. At Temple Beth Am, we are not holding Minyan daily in person. And the only Minyan that we have in person on Shabbat is on this very large field that we have that cannot hold hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people distanced from one another. So we, as a conservative shul, had to figure out what does it look like for us to be a shul that has Minyan every day and be able to still hold people in a fashion of Minyan, which, as we mentioned at the beginning, very often Minyan, especially in large shuls, is held by people who are saying Kaddish, whether that's for a yard site or that's for someone who's actually in mourning currently. And so very quickly, the conservative movement decided that there were different ways to get around using Zoom as a way to have a Minyan. What I'm about to say is not agreed upon in all conservative shuls. Some conservative shuls are more lenient than what I'm about to describe. Some conservative shuls do not consider Zoom a Minyan at all, which is typical of the conservative movement to not necessarily be on the same page on one topic. But at Temple Beth Am, we decided that it was extremely important that we continue to say Mourner's Kaddish. So anytime there are 10 people on a screen, we will say Mourner's Kaddish. We count women in our Minyan, so it's 10 people, not 10 men. And we will allow people to say Mourner's Kaddish because we don't only believe that it is something that is important as a part of just general prayer life, but that it's also pastoral, that someone who was saying Kaddish before, or God forbid had to start saying Kaddish in the middle of COVID, that those are words that people associate with that period of grief and that period of needing to be held by their community. So our Mar D'Atra, our senior rabbi, decided that that was the only thing we were going to say of these categories of things that you cannot say without a Minyan, and consider Zoom a Minyan. So before I turn it over or you ask questions or whatever, I just want to share that this actually comes from a piece in the Shulchan Aruch, that body of law that I mentioned before, that talks about how there are different configurations in which you could be in a synagogue space where you can see people, but you're not really in the same room as them, but you can hear them. And so is that okay? Is that considered a Minyan? Many, many years ago, I have it here. I'll give you the exact date in a moment. Many years ago, there was a tshuva in the conservative movement written about being able to use Skype as a way for people who, obviously, people were not in quarantine, but some people can't always get to Minyan. So can I daven from my office with a Minyan that's already present and say amen to their moments that are needed for a Minyan? Can I also say Kaddish? And the answer was yes, because you could be heard and you could hear. And in the Shulchan Aruch, it talks about if you're standing behind the building or if you're standing in the building but around a corner or anything like that, that you are still somehow part of the Minyan if you can hear what is going on and you can respond and they can hear your response. So I just wanted to point out that it is coming from lawful behavior, but it is not considered to necessarily be the law that you can say Mourner's Kaddish without 10 people, 10 men in the traditional world in your presence. So that's how Temple Beth Am decided to sway ourselves. So I just want to add that to the conversation because I think it's a really big topic right now in terms of Minyan, how different shuls are are dealing with Minyan. In the Orthodox world, I know that another big piece of Minyan was how to count when things started to reopen. Do we only allow it once we can have 20 people so that men and women can come, or do we just say 10 men? I know that was a back and forth as well. So the conservative movement, it was more the mourner's Kaddish, and the Orthodox movement, the other topic.
I'll just touch on one piece of this before we sort of open the floor, because I think, I was talking before about the ways in which there's sort of the difference between personal private practice versus policy issues, as it were. And like mourner's Kaddish is a great example, because mourner's Kaddish is something that does not really have halachic origins, basically. It's like a very late addition to the service in terms of like historically. It's not something that really was said. It's not in the Talmud anywhere. It's something that's very late. And so in theory, when it comes to making leniencies, to say Baruch Hu without a minyan, and this is, I'm sure, part of Temple Beth Am's decision-making about what to, saying mourner's Kaddish with a Zoom minyan, but not other things, is like things like Kedusha and Baruch Hu and so forth are what we call Divarim Shebikdusha, things that, pieces that have holiness to them, and which require a minyan. Mourner's Kaddish doesn't fit in that. Mourner's Kaddish, like I said, is sort of a very historically late addition to the service, and yet there's a lot of, as Rabbi Schatz talked about, there's a lot of like pastoral connection, and people feel, people come to shul so that they can say mourner's Kaddish. Like there's like a very deep connection people have with Kaddish. There's many books written about Kaddish by people who have gone through that process, but it's not something that, like, from a legal perspective, actually matters all that much. Which means, in theory, it would be an easy thing to be lenient about. So, yeah, in theory, it'd be a thing to be lenient about. But for policy reasons, in Israel, right around Passover, there was a tshuva that came out from a leading rabbi, like really a major leading rabbi, saying that you should say mourner's Kaddish with Zoom minions. And it was sort of like accepted widely in Israel, and like not accepted, or I'm not gonna say anywhere, because there are a couple places, but like almost universally not accepted in America. And the reason has nothing to do with Jewish law. It is entirely about policy. And like in Israel, there's much more of this culture of people going to Minyan, and people go to Minyan generally, because there's Minyan imam on every corner. And there isn't that same kind of like fear that once, if you tell people you can do mourner's Kaddish with a Zoom minyan, then once normal life resumes, no one's going to think that is like a substitute for actually going to minyan. Whereas I think in America, there's much more of a fear of, if we tell people this counts as minyan, then they're not going to come to shul. Like, I think that played into a lot of the decision making on the parts of synagogues, to say like, no, and people aren't perhaps as knowledgeable about like Jewish law, and so might think, oh, they're saying Kaddish, so they count this as a minyan, when in truth, like, no, they don't count it as a minyan. It's just that Kaddish, like I said, doesn't really have the same halachic weight to it as other things. So.
Before we open it, I do want to say that there are other things that the conservative movement, the modern Orthodox movement, the more right-wing Orthodox movement came out with as poems or psalms or readings that you could do, so that if your community decides to not say mourner's Kaddish, that those are things that could be said whether in your own home or in a community, to kind of have the same feeling as saying mourner's Kaddish that you might have if you were in a community of 10 where you could say mourner's Kaddish, the typical prayer that we know. We as a community decided not to do something alternative because we thought that the actual words that people know of mourner's Kaddish felt very comforting and like a rite of passage almost in those moments where they needed them.
I'll add one story from Rabbi Silver. Here's the conservative rabbi at Sher Chadash, the conservative synagogue here. She's also a member of whatever it's called, the Committee on Laws and Standards. Is that what you call it?
Oh, that was so close. The Committee of Jewish Law and Standards.
Okay, that's close. The conservative movement's Sanhedrin, as it were. That's right. Who makes law for the movement? And I think Shir Chadash fairly early on similarly started saying mourners Kaddish by Zoom, if I'm not mistaken. And the reason is because there was like a board meeting one time, and someone who was at the board meeting was like, "Oh, there's 10 Yitz Kadal Yitz Kadash," and just like started saying mourners Kaddish. And she was like, "Well, I guess they see it as it feels like a minyan to them, so it must be the." And she, and when that conversation came up in the Committee on Jewish Laws and Standards room, she was like, "Look, this is something that just happened to me the other day. That like at a board meeting, someone just started saying mourners Kaddish because there was 10 people there, and so it was
the first tshuva to pass in the CJLS on March 17th, 2020, which was also my bat mitzvah.
2020.
Not 2020. What?
That was my question. Yeah.
They passed this tshuva, right? After many of us went to hibernation, they passed to be able to use Zoom specifically for mourners Kaddish, but the other dvarim that were not considered. Any thoughts, questions, comments? I spoke a lot tonight. I'm sorry about that. I don't tend to lecture. No thoughts.
Let's scroll through the chat, see if anything else. There's a lot of the topics, but in the earlier conversation, I know some Beth Am people were there for part of that. We sort of touched on a lot of those pieces of the difference between kashrut and those kinds of things.
We can talk about hashgacha for 3 minutes if you want.
I'm sure.
Go ahead.
No, I'm sure. I think it's. I don't know so much of what that whole scene of Nati calling the Rabbanut and getting yelled at. And then the Rabbanut like actually looking into it, I feel like it was like very Israeli. like he called and they're like, "Don't you know it was a crime to kashrut fraud is a crime?" He's like, "Look, I'm calling to ask." And then suddenly the guy's replaced, and then like he feels really bad about it. But I don't think there's so much to say.
But also in Israel, it's so much more contentious to have a teudah of any kind, because when I lived in Israel in Rehavia, there was this very cute little cafe around the corner from my house, really on the corner of where I lived, and it had a non-Rabbanut hashgacha, so a non-Rabbanut certificate of being kosher, but it was a dairy place. So they weren't open on Shabbat. They abided by all those rules. They also had kosher food, but they didn't want to pay the Rabbanut because they were liberal, secular Jews. So in Israel, it's also extremely, talk about political, extremely woven into the political scene there. And so you see different, what's the word in English? Signs, declarations, stamps of approval. I don't know what the word is in English, that on different windows based upon what they would, what?
Certifications.
Certifications, thank you. Yep, that is the word. That they have based upon what they serve, who they paid, and all those kinds of things. And in America, we have a gazillion and 5 different Heckshers that you can find just by walking into Trader Joe's. And you'll see a stamp that has the U.S. on it, and you'll see a stamp that has California on it, and you'll see a stamp that's the OU, which is the most famous. And it all means that someone paid someone to make sure that it was kosher, and that person said it's kosher, and they got money and they put a stamp on it.
I just want to say that in Tel Aviv, if you go there, there's a Nola American bakery, New Orleans. Some Israelis lived here in New Orleans and then moved back to Israel, and they have a teudah kashrut, I guess, if that's what it's called.
Yeah.
But they don't have one because they were Masoti conservative, and when they realized it was basically a game to raise, to pay off a huge sum. So they're not kosher. But it's a nice place if you ever go.
No, go ahead.
So most places in Israel that are kosher have multiple Tudot. And the Rabbanut Tuda is like the baseline. Like you can't have anything else unless you have Rabbanut, right? If you want something else, you need to pay the Rabbanut and have Rabbanut Hashgacha, and then you can add on top of Rabbanut, you can get Badatz, which is like Haredi, and all the other ones. The problem is that all the rabbis in the Rabbanut are Haredi, and none of them would ever eat in a restaurant that was only under Rabbanut Hashgacha, because they would only eat Badatz. And so I actually think this episode it's a very like live issue in the Rabbanut, that certification or like supervision standards are very low to like often non-existent within places that have just, Rabbanut sort of supervision, because like, look, the Rabbanut rabbis wouldn't eat there. So like they got their money from the restaurant, like they wouldn't eat there anyway. So like they're not really incentivized at all to actually make sure that it's kosher. And so a lot of people, particularly with dairy restaurants, like a lot of people won't eat Rabbanut dairy. If it's a dairy restaurant that is only under supervision of the Rabbanut, because they know that the Rabbanut will never go to that restaurant to supervise. Like
isn't there? I'm sorry, an attempt, some alternatives to the Rabbanut?
Yeah. So there's an organization called Hashgacha Pratit, which is a great name, because Hashgacha Pratit is like sort of like divine providence, is like usually, like Hashgacha Pratis, as I would say. But it's also private Hashgacha. So it's so that's an organization that's fought through the courts, and like, because like I said, legally you couldn't have anything else unless you had Rabbanut. You needed to have Rabbanut, and then you could have other things on top. So the idea of Hashgacha Pratit was that it was an alternative to the Rabbanut. I think they can't say like kasher. Like there's some like language things that they can't use the word kosher, but it's sort of like for those who know, Hamevin Yavin, like those who know, when they see it, know that it's a restaurant that's under this kind of supervision, and it's a very different model, right? Rather than the Rabbanut one where you pay a lot of money and no one ever comes. This is like you don't really pay much, but there's sort of, you build a relationship with the rabbis of this organization who'll come teach the owners of the restaurant about kashrut, and sort of it's less like the feeling of getting caught, and it's more about actually like developing a relationship, so that if something comes up and someone, the restaurant screws up, they'll actually call this rabbi and say like, hey, this happened, what do I do? So it's sort of trying to rework the kashrut agency in Israel. I mean, and have won up. I mean, there's been cases that have gone up to the Israeli Supreme Court where Hashgacha Pratit has won. So yeah, that's but that's sort of a change to a very entrenched system, which is still very small at this point, relatively speaking.
So we can talk more about Hashgacha and kashrut. It'll come up many more times in this show. Yeah. And we can talk about that another time. The last thing I'll add to this, and then we can wrap up, and I'll let Rabbi Pernick wrap since I did most of the talking, is my Rav teacher, Rabbi Aaron Alexander, when he teaches kashrut, he talks about how something can be kosher and something can be heckshered. So when you go into... Can you all hear me? It says my head is unstable. Okay. I'll just keep using Trader Joe's. If you go into Trader Joe's and you see that you are buying something that is one ingredient and it doesn't have a Hecksher on it, there are some people who will not buy it because there's not a Hecksher on it. But at the end of the day, if it says chickpeas and water, it is kosher. Right? It is an item. Chickpeas are kosher. Water is kosher. The item is kosher, but it is not heckshered. And Rabbi Pernick and I will disagree on this, which is totally fine. But that is something that I find very comforting when thinking about items of kashrut, and especially in Israel when things have that teudah or not. I am much more comfortable going into a restaurant that has a teudah, But if it doesn't have a teudah for political reasons or because they're taking a stand, is it not a kosher restaurant? Well, I don't know. I would have to go and I would have to figure that out for myself. But it's definitely not Hecksher. I just wanted to add that because I think that he is full of wisdom, and that has been something that has really stayed with me in terms of kosher, and so I wanted to offer that to you. But Rabbi Pernick.
Yeah, I mean, so this came up. This comes up all the time, but like when I was working in North Carolina, my last year of rabbinical school, there was an issue where like it was very, very hard to find Hecksher bread. Just because Sarah Lee was dropping their hashkacha, Sarah Lee, like the Bimbo Breads, which is like the massive bakery that like everything else is under, was like dropping their hashkacha. And in Durham, North Carolina, where there's no kosher anything, like there's no kosher restaurants or anything, like there's like bread was just really hard to find. So, and there was a lot of Israelis, like kind of, I would say Srugim style Israelis, in terms of their firmness, who are, asking, they're like, look, it's really hard to find bread. If we go somewhere and it's just bread, like it's just bread, there's nothing else, can we eat it? And now bread is different than, chickpeas and water, for example. I would say that there are, frequently things that you wouldn't think are problematic actually might be problematic. So one example, I have in my freezer right now a box of, I told Rabbi Shas this, so I have in my freezer a box of black cherry Italian ices that are not kosher. They're not
Heckshered. They're not Heckshered.
And they're not kosher because, what happened was I went to get Italian ices and the brand, I saw there were a bunch of different boxes there and all of them had Heckshers on them. And then I was going to grab one box of one flavor and then I was like, oh, you know what, I'll grab, there's black cherry, I'll grab that instead. And then I looked and it's like, oh no, this one doesn't have a Hecksher on it. Now, if a company, and this is a particular thing to note, like if a company has Heckshers on some products and not on other products, there's probably a reason why. So it's one thing if it's, if we're talking about, it's one thing if it's a small company, out here, like often small companies, they don't have a Hecksher because like, why would they have, why would like Cajun brand salsa made in somewhere in Louisiana like have a Hecksher, right? That's a different story. But if there's a company where like most of their items of one sort are Heckshered and one isn't, like there's probably a reason to it. And it's often things you wouldn't think about, like food dye colors. And like when it comes to, Italian ices, for example, like one or anything that's flavored, that's colored, food with food coloring, like one of the common dyes that's used is made from bugs. And so that makes like a red 40 or something. And so like that, like there's a real reason and people would be like, it's Italian ice, like what's the problem? But like you're eating, it's made from bugs. Like that's an issue from a kosher perspective. So that's my point on, I think often people are
go out with a bang.
What?
Go out with a bang.
Oh, the thing, I think often there's an assumption that, this item is clearly not a problem. And like, there are hidden problems that you might not think about. And, it's just worth having that on your, having that there, that even if something doesn't seem, clearly problematic, it might still be. And there's a reason why some people will only eat food with Heckshers, because it's like someone's there, someone can sign off to the fact that this is okay. Better that way.
So I'm really glad that we ended talking about bugs in a class all about Minyan. It's very connected. I just want to go on record that I chatted to Rabbi Pernick and I said, don't tell them why the dye might not be kosher, because now you're all going to think about bugs every time you look at something that's red. So I was trying to save you. I just want you to know. Anyway, what?
So it's good to be aware. It's good to be aware of these things.
It is good to be, thank you, the master educator. It is good to be aware, you're right. Okay, so we're going to do don't ask questions, just don't ask questions. Don't ask questions. We shouldn't have told you. It's good to be aware about some things. We'll see you next week. Just in the realm of thinking about this class after this, just think about, how Minyan has played a role in your life, especially now. If you are part of a Minyan, if you choose to not be on one digitally, but you will go to one in person or vice versa, and how that just has played into your spiritual life. I think it's something that I think about all the time, and I think it's something very interesting that is coming out of this coronavirus period, and that we were lucky enough to be able to talk about with you today.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.